Welcome to Grappling with Gray, a forum for promoting the development of an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Jonas Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my panelists today. We have Michael Alsey, PhD, who's a clinical psychologist in private practice and at Manhattan School of Music, my wife's alma mater, whose mission is to inspire everyone to live life creatively. Carrie Portell is a partially disabled cowgirl and head-on collision survivor who inspires us to change perspectives by confronting our biggest fears. And Ipek Williamson is an insight coach, meditation advocate, and teacher who intends to bring the world closer to peace and calm, one beautiful soul at a time. And I love that mission statement. So thank you, Ipek, Carrie, and Michael, for being with me today. And let's jump right in. And this is our scenario that we'll be discussing. On June 8th, 1985, British climber Simon Yates was descending from the 21,000-foot summit of, hope I pronounced it correctly, Siula Grande in the Peruvian Andes, when his partner, Joe Simpson, fell and shattered his leg. As blizzard conditions engulfed them, Yates turned to the grueling work of getting his friend down the mountain alive. For 9 hours, Yates labored to lower Simpson by rope down the steep incline 300 feet at a time. Then Simpson lost purchase and began sliding out of control, his ice axe unable to bite into the powdery snow. Up above, Yates felt the rope jerk hard and knew that Simpson had gone over the edge. Yates still had control of the rope, literally holding Simpson's life in his hands. But frostbitten and exhausted after the previous day's climb and the present day's ordeal, Yates had no strength to pull up his friend. All he could do was wait helplessly, which he did as Simpson dangled above the abyss. But after 1 hour, Yates felt the snow beneath his feet begin to give way. In moments, he would be pulled down the slope and over the edge, together with Simpson. Instinctively, he reached for his Swiss Army knife and cut the rope, knowing that he was letting his friend fall to his death. So the question we want to discuss today: did Simon Yates do the right thing? The floor is open.
I can go first on this one. Maybe it was his instinct, but it certainly wouldn't be mine. I'm thinking that if that was his friend, as he said, he should be loyal enough to say, we're going together, we're going to live or die together, but I cannot take your life with my hands, because that's basically what he did. I think the only person who should say, I'm going to give up my life, would be his partner. And if he would have cut the rope, it would have been a totally different scenario. But to save yourself and not your friend, I think, is a selfish act.
Interesting. Michael, Ipek?
Well, I can go next. So I did a little bit of research and looked into this subject and found out that they were not friends. They were just climbing partners, and they didn't know each other from before. But it doesn't make one to let someone go just because they don't know them as a friend. So, but it's just a side note that I wanted to let you know, Carrie. But to me, it's a really difficult question, because nobody would want to find themselves in such a terrifying position. And it's hard to say what is right and what is wrong when you are not in their shoes. Whatever we say here today will be, to me, superficial and from an observative point of view, because only someone who experiences such dilemma would know what it means to cut the rope and let someone fall to their death, even though in this case, Simpson didn't die. So I cannot even begin to imagine what must have been going through Yates' mind during that 1 hour time. So if you cut the rope, your climbing partner will most probably die. But if you don't, then both of you will probably die. And we know that these two people were not friends and knew each other beforehand. They met right before starting to climb, though. Would that be an excuse to let that person fall to their death? That's a good question too. And what kind of difference would it make if the person dangling would be a good friend of Yates? If he knew Simon's family, who will he leave behind? How many people will be devastated by his demise? On the other hand, how is it possible to explain and defend the legitimacy of his action? So when you face the possibility of death, all your values and ethical stature could go out of the window. And the ideal answer could look like, I would not let any other human being fall to their death with my help, and I would fall with them. But when it gets to that point, you can do anything, I think.
Well, you're raising a really interesting point, Ipek, that the advantage of us sitting here talking about this coldly and dispassionately is that we're not in the midst of an emotional decision. And so we can make the effort to be more objective. But the point you're raising is that that is somewhat artificial. And that maybe the emotional state is in fact part of the ethical decision making. So while it's important to have these discussions outside of the moment of crisis and tension so that we can be more objective, there's still a limitation there, because that emotional element is a very real part of our decision-making apparatus. Right? Michael, you have any insights onto that?
Yeah, I love the dilemma. As a literal dilemma, it's a heart-wrenching one. And yet, as a psychologist, I think about it as something that we deal with all the time in a way, of how much do we try and help somebody else who we know is struggling if it also might take us down? And also, how do we find our own organization and stability when yet it's threatened by somebody we care about? And I think when we look at this situation through that prism, we might see that this seemed almost like an outlandish scenario, like who's going to be climbing, a mountain with somebody else and be in this position. But psychologically, we're in this position all the time with our significant other or our children or our friends or our colleagues, of how much do we keep on working to help something go? And at what point do we say they also need to figure it out? So the thing that I thought was interesting about what Yates did, was that he tried for quite a long time to figure out resourceful ways of trying to make the situation better and to make up for and accommodate for the fact that his friend was so injured and couldn't do more. And yet that was failing. And then he continued. So my question would be, if his friend was trying just as hard or was trying to do as much as he could to be resourceful, I wish that they both made the decision together. But barring that perfect solution, I would say if Yates felt that he had done everything possible in trying to figure things out, and he felt that his friend was doing everything, and this was where it was, I think in some ways he might be justified in cutting the rope, as horrific as that is. And I say that as a therapist who's ordinarily fairly empathic, but I do think there's something about how much can we go. And I think you guys bring up a good point about what it's like when we're in the heat of survival. And that's where ethics are really challenging, because how do we work with our own psychological and physical survival? And yet, what do ethics bring us? A way of being civilized that brings us something bigger and more transcendent than that.
Yeah, and to go back to your
That's
point,
why we had Michael here today.
That's right. That's right. And to go back to your point, Carrie, would you frame this as a choice between doing what is logical and what feels right?
I am too of an emotional person. So logic would say, hey, I'm not going to die for this person. I have a chance to save myself, but because it's an emotional decision for me, there's no way that, so if I was holding on to the rope and I'd been holding it and holding it for an hour and my arms just couldn't take it and it started to slip and slip and slip, I feel like that's different. But he cut it. He cut it and said, I'm letting you go. I know I'm letting you go. I'm making a choice to let you go, and you're probably going to die. And then the ironic thing about it is IPEC said he didn't die. So now he's got to say, hey, you let me go. What up, dude?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I was going to spring that a little later, but the way it turns out is that he fell into a snowdrift, and that broke his fall, and he was able to get himself out. So the ironic twist of the story is that perhaps by cutting him free, he actually saved his life. And
I think that's a really good point too, in terms of how transformations happen as surprise. And I think, one of the important things is doing as much and as resourceful as thinking in all different directions, or allowing ourselves to feel. Like Yates was clearly empathizing tremendously with this man. I mean, you got to remember, how long is 9 hours, right? He could have, I want to just give this guy a little bit more credit. That's a very long time when he probably could have gotten down himself a lot faster with a lot less duress. So I think, obviously we're not in the circumstances ourselves, but I think context really matters in these ethical dilemmas, as well as just, Carrie, as you said, that even though he could feel, his partner slipping away, he too was slipping away. And the impersonal forces of nature were as much a part of this equation as anything. And I think that's what's challenging. How are we human in the face of impersonal forces? And yet we're all subject to them. I don't have an answer for that.
and I'm not sure there is an answer for that, except that that's part of the tension of being a human being, is that we do have to grapple with these kinds of dilemmas. And they're, if there's a nice, neat solution we can wrap up in a bow, great. But the real difficult situations in life are not like that. And that's where ethics really comes into play. That's why we call this grappling with the gray, because we need to use our gray matter and resolve those gray areas. And you don't always come away with a warm, fuzzy feeling at the end. Sometimes you're choosing between good and better, and sometimes you're choosing between awful and worse.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is the reasoning that we might invoke here. Can you imagine saying, I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I would let him go? Is that a reasonable line of argument? Is that a good reason to make the choice?
It is to me, it is, though, in the heat of the moment, I really believe that anybody could could make that decision of cutting the rope. And, afterwards, Simon said himself, he said that I would cut the rope myself had I had the knife with me, but we had only one knife, and Yates said it. And I'm glad that he cut it. That's what he said himself. So he obviously forgave him for cutting the rope.
Yeah, in fact, he wrote a book about the episode, and he dedicated it to Simon Yates and thanked him for saving his life.
Yes. But and I really believe that if you ask people, what would you do? Maybe 80% of people will say, well, I would jump with him. I wouldn't let him go. I wouldn't cut the rope. I am having difficulty believing that, because when it gets to a point where you have to make a decision, dying or surviving, it is a huge, big decision to make. And he waited for an hour. I'm sure he thought about all the possibilities, everything that he can do and he cannot do. And at the end, he had ended up cutting the rope. Remember this whole thing reminded me of the Miracle Flight 571 between Montevideo, Uruguay and Santiago, Chile, plane crash in the Andes mountains in 1972. So the people who were in that plane certainly did not think they would end up becoming cannibals. But when you are out of options, maybe you might end up doing things that you would never think you could. And that's exactly why one of my lifelong mottos is never say never.
So do you
Actually,
feel that,
go ahead.
oh, sorry, Jonathan.
No, go ahead.
I had a question came to me. Do you guys feel that if a person is faced with that rawness between, like you said, survival or death, are most of us, you think, in that moment going to choose our own survival over someone else's? What do you guys think?
To me, I would think so.
I think there is a big pull for self-preservation and survival, and yet I think, talking about ethics, I think there's something interesting about how, as human beings, and not only human beings, I think animals too, can transcend that survival instinct by trying to do something larger and going down with a comrade in arms. There's a certain kind of morality in that, and also beauty in that, which I can equally see somebody going with, right? This is my brother, right? Or this is somebody that I brought up here and I'm going down with them. I can equally see that happening too. And I think that's what makes this a thorny question, because I think we are built as human beings to do both, to have this extraordinarily strong self-preservation and survival instinct, and yet we're amongst the most empathic creatures on this planet. And we're built to be extraordinarily empathic. And this is actually what makes us so kind of interesting. This is why I love working with people. So we're sort of a square peg in a round hole, logic and emotions, right? We're built with this fantastic capacity to reason, and yet we're built with these wonderfully rich and animal-like emotions, and they're intertwined. And so I don't know. I certainly can see it completely feasible for him to have said, you know what, in the end, if I must go down, I'm going down with my friend.
It's interesting that you raised the sort of military model, in which soldiers may have a code of ethics that we don't leave anybody behind.
Mm-hmm.
And even when it's impractical to get them out, because that is integral to making this group work. They have to trust each other in life and death situations. And therefore, everybody knows, every single individual knows that every other individual is committed to his or her welfare. And that may be a somewhat isolated mindset. You wouldn't necessarily apply that mindset to a situation like ours, although in theory, perhaps you could. There's actually a model for this in Jewish law. The sages create a very artificial situation, one that's unlikely to ever happen, but they do it in order to illustrate a point. If two people are lost in the desert, or let's say they're wandering through the desert, not lost, but they're wandering through the desert, and one of them has a canteen of water and the other one doesn't. And again, this is artificial, but through whatever means, it could be determined that there's enough water for one person to survive walking through the desert and get out, but there's not enough water for two people to survive. So if I'm holding the canteen, should I share my water with my companion? Because if I do, we're both going to die. If I don't, he's surely going to die. So what's the correct choice in that situation? And according to Jewish law, not Jewish philosophy, but Jewish law, I am not allowed to share my water. Because while I'm on this earth to help others and to serve others, I can't do that until I first take care of my own well-being. And so my first responsibility is to myself in order that I can then be of service to others. And I when I first learned this model, which was many years ago, I really spent a lot of time reflecting on it for the reasons that we've been talking about. There's the thought that I'm walking along with this companion, with this friend, and I'm not sharing. And how am I going to feel? And what's it going to do to me? What kind of guilt am I going to carry? In many ways, it would be easier for me to share my water and not worry about the consequences. And yet, is that in fact the responsible thing to do? Because there I'm really abandoning logic in favor of emotions. And while that may feel good in the moment, from a more objective point of view, it is somewhat hard to defend. Any thoughts?
I have the same question of, like, I try to put myself in that person's shoes who is choosing themselves. And the same question comes up to me. What you have referred to both times is, if I choose myself, how am I going to live with that choice and it not devour my soul?
Isn't there a little bit of selfishness in that? I mean, I understand. I feel exactly the same way. But at that point, I'm making it about me more than making it about the other person.
Yeah, how am I gonna live with it? Instead of, I will live and be and serve, have the opportunity to continue serving however I can to the world, to the community, to my family, to everyone around me.
And what about what would I want? What would I want if I were the person hanging at the end of the rope? Would I want my friend to give up his life, or my companion to give up his life for no good reason? Or would I want him to save himself?
I would want to have a discussion and say, yes, please cut the rope. Thank you for asking.
Ideally,
Don't just
yeah.
do it on your own.
Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, like, in a way, if he went down, there would be nobody to witness and tell the story. And there's also something about that as well, right? That even if Simpson fell down, right? That if Yates was still around, he could tell the story and honor his friend. The other thing too about Yates is that, look at the degree of empathy in terms of 10 hours. I think that's really, really striking. And I think you're right. I think it's really interesting. Sometimes we also forget about the empathy for ourselves, but also the empathy others have for ourselves. And you're very right. Simpson might also have been thinking, wow, like, I don't want my friend, to lose his life because of me. And so there is something interesting about, like, kind of holding some of the divine, not letting it all go.
Yeah, well, that actually reminds me of a story, and I'll share this, and then I'll ask each of you to make your closing remarks. And I'm already thinking of a number of ways we can continue this in the second segment. But there's a story I read about a mother and daughter who were in one of the concentration camps, and they managed to survive together. And at one point, the mother became very ill, and the daughter was able to hide her in the barracks while the daughter, went out to work. And when she came back, she had been given a bowl of soup, which the mother wasn't able to get because she was in hiding. And she came in and she insisted that the mother drink the soup because she was ill. And the mother insisted that the daughter drink the soup because she needed the strength because she had been working. And they've all argued back and forth, each one insisting the other one should take the soup. And finally, the mother said, I would rather pour the soup on the ground than take it away from you. And the daughter said, I'm not going to drink it. And the mother poured it out on the ground. And when I first read this story, I was very upset. I said, well, share it. What do you accomplish? But after a while, thinking about it, I realized what they accomplished is, what were the Nazis trying to do to them? They were trying to destroy their humanity. They were trying to turn them into animals. And that gesture of defiance, of pouring out the soup, I'm not going to let you take away my humanity. Sometimes there are good reasons for giving up our lives. And recognizing as soldiers in battle, giving up their lives for one another, firemen, policemen, all sorts of situations, parents for children. These are real life situations that happen. And I think we need to start with logic, but I think we need to temper our logic with an intuitive emotion. And then we can start to get a little bit closer to making the best decision possible. So I'd like each of you to sum up, if you would. Carrie, will you start?
I can go first. I feel like at the end of the day, when someone is that scared of losing their life, or logically, I guess, that both of them may lose their life, I couldn't fault them for choosing to save themselves. On a personal level, for myself, I know that I couldn't live with the situation. Even though luck would have it, he fell on a snowbank and he lived. I don't think I would have that such luck. So I'm too emotional. I make decisions honestly based on emotion for the most part. So I would end up going down with him.
Ipek.
Well, I would do the same, even though I believe that most people wouldn't. But I think I would. I mean, at the end of the day, I wouldn't be able to live with myself either, and I would go and hope that we don't die. and maybe even if he would jump with him or fall with him, maybe he wasn't going to die either. Maybe he was going to die and the other guy was going to survive. Who knows? But even though I don't believe most people would do that, I think I would jump. I wouldn't let him, I wouldn't cut it myself.
Michael, you have the last word.
I think you presented us with a Sophie's choice here. Either choice was a really difficult one to make. And yet, I think one of the other kind of hidden messages of this story is we plan and God laughs. And, despite preparing and having our heart and thinking as widely as we can, providence or circumstances or things beyond our control also kind of resolve these things. And I think the best that we all can do is to try to figure out how we can put as much energy, thoughtfulness, and emotion into making the best decision in tough spots. And then trusting that hopefully the universe will take care of it.
And of course, if you have a theological point of view, then the story does not end in this life, but continues after that. But it is a continual tension, as we said, between the head and the heart. As in the Jewish teachings, the longest distance in the universe is from the head to the heart. We can know things intellectually, and it's an entirely different reality when it becomes personal. And
you know what's interesting? You know what's interesting too, Rabbi? I actually think you made me think of something. This must be what Abraham felt when he was about to sacrifice Isaac. Here, he's waited so long. How old was Sarah? Like 100?
She was 90, he was 100.
Yeah, you know, he was 100, she was 90. And they just have this child who is going to be the heir and the progenitor of all these amazing things. And yet Abraham is told to sacrifice him. And I imagine Abraham was thinking something of the same Sophie's choice of, I'm supposed to do this, and yet I'm doing this, but why? and you know, it's really interesting to see that, you know, circumstance that, you know, God kind of intervened, the angel intervened really, right, in that story. But I think there's something of that. Sometimes, ironically, creative things happen at the moment when we think we're about to destroy everything. And so sometimes, just as we all thought, I thought he plummeted to his death, but we all found out that something creative happened out of this surprisingly, excruciatingly difficult episode.
Yeah, and I'm planning actually a series on biblical ethics, so we will come back to Abraham and Isaac another time, certainly beyond our scope right now, but I appreciate you bringing up that imagery, because it is sort of the archetype of the impossible situation, which is exactly what it's meant to be. So thank you, all of you, Deepak, Carrie, and Michael. I hope you will join me again sometime down the line. And thank you for listening. If you'd like to suggest an ethical scenario or dilemma for discussion, please go to my website, jonasandgoldson.com, and use the contact box to submit your proposal. If you are a Grappling with the Gray member, please use the community link to participate in a follow-up Q&A right now for continued discussion. And if you're not a member, please go to gwtg.live. That's gwtg.live. You can sign up for a free 30-day trial and enjoy all member benefits. Please join us again next week for another ethical discussion as our panelists grapple with the gray.